I keep worrying about the hobgoblin, Mary said. Aaron asked, "How's that?" He scanned the crowd in the street ahead. Many folk had covered up their heads against the drizzle, which made the task of spotting Kesk's henchmen more difficult. Still, it appeared that all the people in the immediate vicinity were law-abiding sorts scurrying off to their jobs, and that made sense. Most of Weevil's outlaws slept in the morning. In fact, Aaron looked forward to doing the same, but he and Mary had one more stop to make first. "Will the creature really help the other slaves run away?" she said, "or will it betray them? It is Goblinkin, after all. I'm sure it has no love for the civilized races." Mary had stayed awake as long and worked as hard as Aaron, but she still seemed relatively fresh. It was as if the rising of the sun, which generally made him yawn, had infused her with fresh vitality. He snorted and said, "Goblinkin, of course. I bet your fingers were just itching to shoot the creature. And never mind that it risked its neck to help me fight the mantis. I didn't say it was inconceivable that it would keep its word, nor do I relish killing whatever you think. I certainly took no joy in shooting your friends." "I'm sure you didn't," he said sardonically. They swung around a mule-drawn wagon heaped with bags of flour with bags of flour, the product of one of the mills upriver. "I didn't," she insisted. "And I'm sorry I didn't try to rescue your father when the Red Axes were kidnapping him. I shouldn't have let Sefri talk me out of it. It's this place. It makes me doubt my instincts. It even makes it hard to know right from wrong." He shook his head in puzzlement and asked, "Is Weevil truly so much fouler than other towns?" "You've never visited another?" "Not a big one, just little villages hereabouts." Mary took a long stride to avoid stepping in a puddle. "Well," she said, "Weevil is the worst I've seen. I'll admit, though, I've never visited a city that didn't make my skin crawl. They all have their dirt, crowds, and stenches. That's why I'm a scout. Because cities spook you? Because as a ranger you spend most of your time in the parts of the world that are worth living in: forests, mountains, rivers, and prairies, and the sea." He grinned and said, "Without a soft bed or a mug of beer to be held for leagues in any directions." She smiled back. "You don't miss easy living once you lose the habit," she said. "Not that I ever had it much, growing up on a little farm on the edge of the wilderness. Haven't you ever wanted to roam, to see wonders you could never even have imagined? Everything I want is here in Weevil." It was true, but just for a moment Aaron wondered whether he might discover something more to desire if only he opened up his eyes. Umbert Blackdale's thick-built brownstone drum of a tower came into view around the next bend, and the sight banished the peculiar, wistful thought from his mind. "That's it," he said, pointing. Mary peered at it and said, "I don't see any sentries." "I don't either, but Umbert will have somebody keeping an eye out. He always does. Not that it matters. True, considering that we're proposing to serve ourselves up to him on a platter." "You know," Aaron said, "you don't need to come inside. I can do this by myself." "I'll stick with you. To help me fight my way out again if necessary. That, and to keep you from deciding our alliance is a mistake and skipping out the back door." He chuckled and said, "You're finally learning to think like somebody who belongs in Weevil. That's an insult, but I'll let it pass." They headed for the tower and climbed the 3 steps to the entrance. A high arched oaken panel with a smaller door scarcely taller than waist-height inset in the larger one. Aaron clanked the wrought iron knocker up and down, and they waited. After a time, Mary said, "Maybe they decided they don't want any part of our problems." "Oh, maybe," Aaron replied. "They need a couple of minutes to ready their traps." She scowled and said, if you actually think that." The full door swung open, and a spooky man with waxed upturned mustaches frowned out. "Get inside," he grunted. Aaron stepped through, and Mary followed. Beyond the threshold was a gloomy, windowless anteroom. "Now give me your weapons," the sticky man said. "I'm here to see Humbert Blackdale," Aaron replied. "He knows me. We've pulled jobs together. He knows who's come calling," said the tough. "And he told me either to collect your blades or send you on your way." Aaron sighed. He hadn't expected to win that particular argument, but it had been truly a try. He handed over all his earthen fangs except for one throwing knife he was currently carrying strapped to his forearm beneath his sleeve. By itself, it was a slim defense, but better than nothing. Glowering, plainly not liking it one bit, Mary surrendered her sword, bow, quiver, and dirk. The ruffian hummed everything on a pegboard, then led the visitors deeper into the tower. His heart pounding, Aaron waited for other outlaws to rush out at them. They didn't. The inhabitants of the well-kept, lavishly furnished spire eyed the newcomers speculatively, but made no effort to interfere with them. Most of the folk who were still awake were smaller even than gnomes, like Burgle, smaller than many human children. That was as Aaron expected. The lynxes were notorious for being Weevil's preeminent halfling gang, though they did occasionally recruit a representative of another race. Like Kesk, they'd invited Aaron once upon a time, but unlike the Tanaric, hadn't taken offense when he declined. The stocky ruffian led the visitors up a flight of stairs. The climb felt awkward because the risers were too low and shallow for long human legs and feet. Still, Aaron managed to ascend without stumbling. At the top, they found the leader of the lynxes seated at a halfling-sized table, tucking into a breakfast substantial enough for a giant. Humbert Blackdale had the straight, skinny, raven hair, luxuriant sideburns, and pleasant features characteristic of his kind. In his case, a round face and a sprinkle of freckles contributed to the general appearance of amiability. Despite the short sword lying ready at hand among his silverware and fine porcelain crockery, he scarcely looked the part of an outlaw chieftain. But anyone familiar with Weevil's criminal element could attest to the fact that he was almost as dangerous a felon as Kesk, though he lacked the latter's instinct for sheer viciousness. "Good morning, Aaron," the halfling called. "Who's your friend?" "Mary Buckman of the Red Heart Guild," the ranger replied. Humbert frowned and asked, "The same guide who killed Caridi and the others?" "Yes," Aaron said, "but I can afford to care about that right now." "If you say so," Humbert said with a shrug. "They were your friends. Welcome to the both of you, then. Will you join me? I like a good breakfast before I turn in, and I think Cook made enough for a couple more plates." The twinkle in his blue eyes said he understood very well that the kitchen had prepared enough eggs, toast, ham, bacon, and slices of apple and melon to feed a dozen. Aaron hadn't eaten since the start of the previous night, and the steaming food both looked and smelled appetizing. He opened his mouth to accept the invitation, and it occurred to him, What if something was drugged? That would explain why the Lynxes hadn't tried to overwhelm him and Mary by force of arms. They knew an easier way to take them prisoner. Yet he decided to gamble on Humbert. Otherwise, he and Mary wouldn't be there at all. It made no sense to go that far, then risk offending the halfling by declining his hospitality. Accordingly, Aaron said, "Thanks. We could use a meal. I'm afraid these cloaks are wet. Toss them anywhere." Humbert said, "Someone will come around to clean up after us." The little chairs were hopeless for full-grown humans. Aaron realized that he and Mary would do better sitting on kneeing on the floor. She looked entirely comfortable in that attitude. He supposed scouts were used to taking their meals without the benefit of any sort of furniture. The food was delicious, and nourishment seemed to push back his weariness a little. That was good. He wanted his wits sharp for the conversation to come. Humbert let his guests eat in peace for a while, with only the clink of their forks on their plates to break the silence. Eventually he said, "Well, my friend, it seems you are the most popular man in Weeble. Everyone is looking for you, including the Lynxes." Aaron asked. "Of course," Humbert said. His voice as serious as could be. "When I clap my hands, a net will fall from the ceiling." Mary glanced upwards, and the halfling grinned. I'm joking. The Tanaruk is offering a considerable bounty, enough to tempt most anyone, but I'm inclined to let the Red Axes do their own dirty work." Aaron said, "I was hoping you still hated him." Humbert smiled, but his eyes were cold. Hate's such an ugly word," said the halfling. "Let's just say that he and I have been trying to pick many of the same plums for quite a while now. As I recall, he made a couple of attempts to kill you. I survived and sent a warning. It's old news now. Let's talk about your adventures. What was in the lockbox you stole?" Aaron saw no point in giving that particular piece of information away. "I don't know," he said. "It's warded, and I haven't been able to crack it. If you don't ever know what it is, then why didn't you hand it over to Kesk as agreed? It's not like you to break a deal." Kesk knew the box would be well protected. He didn't warn me, and Carity, Dow, and Gavitt died. What's more, the Red Axes were planning to murder whichever of us survived the job. So no one could trace the coffer to them. Fair enough, that certainly relieves you of any obligation, though it doesn't explain why you're running around with the same guard you robbed in the Paradigm. Kess took my father hostage, Aaron said. Humbert frowned and said, "That's a breach of the code. As I see it, Nikos was one of us in his time, and always dealt fairly with his fellow thieves. He earned the right to live safely in his retirement. When has Cass ever truly cared about the code? You have a point. Anyway, Mary offered to help me rescue my father. In return, I'll give the strongbox back to her." Shifting his gaze to the scout, Humbert arched an eyebrow. "Wouldn't it be easier just to knock this rascal over the head when he isn't looking?" the halfling asked. Mary, tie him up, then torture the location of the coffer out of him. Murray glared at him and said, "I gave an oath." "Of course," Humbert said. "Forgive me, I meant no offense. So it's the two of you against the Red Axes and all the lesser gangs who truckle to them. I'm afraid you're still facing some long odds." "You Lynxes could improve them," Murray said, "by joining forces with us." "Why," said the halfling, "would we do that?" If you hate Kes, she replied, this is a chance to spite or maybe even kill him. Outlaws don't prosper by indulging such passions, said the halfling. The successful ones concentrate on gold and silver. If that's the case, Mary said, the man to whom the lockbox rightfully belongs will reward you. How much will he pay? Humbert asked. Enough to warrant risking my entire operation in another blood feud with the strongest gang in Weevil? It seems unlikely. Mary drew a deep breath, evidently to calm herself, then said, Look, you spoke of following a code. Well, if the coffer doesn't reach its proper destination, a good many innocent folk will suffer. Lord Cuin and the people of Ormeth need the gold. The sale of it will bring. Humbert poured himself some tea from a silver pot. I've never been to Ormeth, he said, but I've heard tell of the place. The proudest, most warlike city in the Shining Plains, ready to attack its neighbors at the twitch of a cat's tail. If they're currently enduring hardship, perhaps they brought it on themselves. Mary blinked. Plainly, Humbert's knowledge of faraway lands had taken her by surprise. She pressed on. Let's talk about Weevil then. I can't tell you what's in the strongbox. It's not my secret to give away. I will say that in the right hands it can bring prosperity to a good many folk. Humbert waved his hands in a vague gesture that took up the spacious room. The gleaming table set with its bounty of food, the thick carpets adorning the hardwood floor, and the vivid tapestries on the walls. Weevil's prosperous already, he said. For you, Reavers, Mary answered, but how many other folks suffer as a result of your killing, stealing, enslaving? How many rot in poverty because they're too honest to join one of the gangs? It doesn't have to be that way. Given the proper opportunity, Weevil could make its gold lawfully. Which doesn't sound like nearly as much fun, Humbert said, and he shot Aaron a wink. It would be healthier, Mary said. The rest of the Border Kingdom scorn Weevil for the nest of robbers it is. Someday, one of your neighbors is going to clean it up. In other words, conquer, rule, and exploit you to suit themselves, unless you mend your ways. Humbert added milk and sugar to his tea. Mr. Ranger, he said, you have some interesting notions, but I must tell you, I don't aspire to be a god or even a faceless master, and I'm not prepared to take responsibility for the welfare of every wrench in a Weevil. I have enough to do just looking after my own followers, and as for the threat of someone marching into town and taking over, well, I'll deal with it when and if it happens. The Greyblades have never managed to stamp out the Lynxes, and I doubt that any Outlander garrison would fare any better. Mary scowled and said, Then you won't fight alongside us? No, Humbert said, certainly not. Aaron should have known better, even if you did it. I did, Aaron said. The halfling eyed him quizzically and asked, Then why did you come to see me? Surely this isn't just a social visit. Naturally, Aaron said. You aren't going to wage open war against Ketch simply for my sake, or my father. It's not in your interest. To his surprise, Aaron felt angry at Humbert, as if Mary's extravagant fancies about the duty and honor had infected his own particular thinking. He strained to quash the irrational feeling. But there is a way you can help us, and yourself too. I'm listening. Mary and I have been raiding Kesh's various operations, said Aaron. You can do the same. Steal his profits and destroy ventures that compete with your own. Kill the Red Axes responsible for controlling particular pieces of territory. Then move in yourself. You won't ruin Kesk, but you'll weaken him and improve your own position. How does that differ from declaring all-out war? It's difficult if you make it seem like I'm the one doing all... No, it's different if you make it seem like I'm the one doing all the damage, Aaron replied. That's why it doesn't come back on you. No, but rather on you, said the halfling. However, this business with the coffer turns out, Kesh will never forgive you. It's already too late to worry about that. I just need him driven crazy and all the red axes running around town hunting me, even more frantically than they already are. Humbert shrugged and said, In that case, I agree to your proposal, and I pray the master of all thieves will receive your spirit kindly when the half-demon sends it into shadow. By midday, the rain had stopped, and the sun had broken through the clouds. As she prowled the streets, Zephyrus rather wished it were otherwise. A good many people were wandering around enjoying the warm golden light, and it would be inconvenient if someone recognized her as the same woman who'd killed 2 Greyblades and worked dark magic in the vicinity of Slurvin's sword. She suspected she might have done as well to stay in her hideout until dusk, for after all, her quarry had likely gone to ground. Yet, once she'd slept for a couple hours, she found it impossible to linger. She was too impatient to take up her errand once again. Her seeming lack of progress evoked an unaccustomed feeling of frustration. As the Arcanoloth had promised, Murray had led her to Kesk, who had in turn brought her into contact with Aaron. Then, however, everything had gone wrong. The thief had eluded her. The wizard in green had subsequently turned the red axes against her, and as a result, she was more or less right back where she'd started. But obviously, she couldn't let it rest there. Couldn't fail the Lady of Loss in the Dark Moon, born a slave in Malfarand. Zephyrus had suffered the abuse of a master and mistress who used her cruelly. Finally, she escaped their household only to discover a life in the streets, picking through rotting garbage in search of edible scraps, freezing on cold nights, selling herself for coppers. That was equally terrifying and degrading. It was then that she truly learned to hate the world, to recognize all its bright promises of freedom and happiness for the lies they were. When the Order of the Dark Moon recruited her, it rescued her from want and squalor, and cured her of fear by teaching her to kill. But even more importantly, the Lady of Loss gave her disciples the assistance of the vileness of creation, that gave her the knowledge gave her disciples the assurance that the vileness of creation would one day dissolve into the purity of oblivion, and it was that knowledge that truly sustained Zephyrus. She thought that without it, she might have lost her mind. She knew that every errand she completed brought universal obliteration a small step closer, albeit generally in a way no mere mortal could comprehend. Such being the case, she never allowed herself to fail, and never would. But how was she to proceed? She'd considered summoning the Arcanoloth again, but experience had taught her it was generally pointless to seek a second such consultation on the same problem. The spirit likely wouldn't have anything new to tell her. She could stand watch over one of the markets full of smuggled and stolen goods, brothels, gambling halls, mordane dens, counterfeiters' lairs, or other enterprises the Red Axes still had running. Kesk had given her a list. but the odds of intercepting Aaron at any given one of them were slim. He simply had too many to choose from, and wasn't likely to strike before nightfall anyway. In the meantime, one of the Red Axe sentries might spot her lurking about. Ordinarily, she would have pitted her trained aptitude for stealth against their vigilance without hesitation, but she didn't know what magical devices the wizard might have supplied to heighten their natural abilities. After some consideration, a vague instinct prompted her to visit those locations Aaron had already raided. She didn't know what she might discover there, but thought it would be easy enough to find out. Spread thin, the Red Axes were unlikely to mount much of a guard over a place the red-bearded thief had already attacked. She hadn't learned anything at the blackened ruin of the floating wine shop. The place had burned down to the waterline. She could only hope the slave market off Dead King's Walk would prove more instructive. As she made her approach, she scanned the busy street for signs that someone was keeping an eye on the place. If so, she couldn't tell it from outside the high fence, all a bristle with nails. She marched up to the entrance as if she had everything right in the world to do so, and no one paid her any mind. The gate was locked, so she whispered a charm of opening. For a split second, she stood in cool shadow, as if a cloud had passed before the sun. The latch clacked, yielding to the magic. She slipped through the gate, pushed it shut behind her. The hinges squeaked a little. Before her, the enclosure was deserted. Peaceful at first glance, only the splashes of dried blood and discharged crossbow bolts on the muddy ground gave evidence of the violence that had erupted there the night before. Well, those and the taunting, a chalk in bold white strokes on the roof of one of the low, unwalled slave kennels. Zephyrus surmised that Aaron Randell didn't know how to write his name, but could manage his initials. Once satisfied that none of Kesk's minion was going to leap out and attack her, Zephyrus prowled around, examining the ground. She found the broken fetters and the hammers and chisels the thralls had used to strike them off. On the ground nearby were the distinctive tracks the brass mantis had made as it hopped and scuttled about. The rest of the scene was a muddled confusion that only a ranger might have deciphered. Zephyrus felt irritated with herself for even trying. Suppose she could read the tracks. Suppose she could follow the course of the battle from the first flight of quarrels to the final knife thrust. What difference would it make? This was all just a waste of time. She started to turn to go, and a pang of intuition spun her back around, just in time to glimpse movement inside the window of the tumble-down shack at the back of the yard. Somebody had peeked out at her, then ducked back down under cover, but not quite quickly enough. Probably just a Red Axe with the good sense to be leery of tackling Zephyrus by himself. That meant he was no threat at present. But since she and the gang were overt enemies, she saw no point in leaving him alive to get in the way later on. Zephyrus extracted a chakram from its pocket, charged the shed, and spread through the doorway, hands poised to deflect a missile or blade. But it wasn't a weapon that assailed her, rather a shrill scream piercing her ears. Huddled on the floor in the far corner, a young woman with an upturned nose and straw-colored hair squenched her eyes shut and shrieked again and again. The Blonde seemed to be rather comely, though it was hard to tell with her features. Contorted tears streamed down her cheeks, and snot glistened on her upper lip. She had shackle galls on her ankles, but otherwise appeared relatively free of bruises, scars, and other signs of abuse. She looked well fed, too. Zephyrus knew what tender young female slaves had to do to earn soft treatment, and felt a surge of contempt directed in equal measure at the wretch before her and the child she herself had been. The feeling was a distraction, and she stifled it with a practiced ease. Viewed properly, the blonde was despicable, but no more so than any other created thing, which was to say, she was of no importance except as a potential resource to further Zephyrus's mission. Assuming the thrall knew something of significance, how best to extract it, ordinarily Zephyrus would have opted for threats and torture, but the blonde was already frightened beyond the point of hysteria. It seemed unlikely that heightening her terror would render her any more coherent. So distasteful though it was, the monastic rearranged her features into the same sympathetic somber she had worn while drifting about with Mary.